and the only people who will have the ability to communicate orally will be the panelists. Good afternoon again. On behalf of ACCT and AACC, thank you so much for joining us for our webinar to cover the Community College Legislative Agenda for the 117th Congress, which will cover 2021 and 2022. My name is Ji-Hang Lee. I'm the Senior Vice President for ACCT. I'm joined by my colleagues, David Baime, who is the AACC Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy Analysis. David really needs to shorten his title. Katie Brown, who is also the ACCT Director of Government Relations. Jim Hermes, who's the AACC Associate Vice President for Government Relations, and Jose Miranda, who's the ACCT Senior Government Relations Associate. This is your team in Washington, D.C., who advocates on behalf of all the community colleges across this country. Before I begin and showcase the agenda, I will take a moment of privilege to just thank the membership for all the work that you have done in the last 2 years during the 116th Congress. We have, through this pandemic, through some of the activity of the federal government, through Congress and administration, we were able to accomplish a lot in terms of legislatively, from the CARES Act money, from this previous, from this last consolidated appropriations money, to the restoration of Pell grants for individuals that are incarcerated, to increasing the Pell grant maximum, to changes in the FAFSA form. All of these things could not have been done without your support and help from the field. So that I want to definitely mention before we get going through this agenda. Jose, the next slide. So this is kind of our agenda for today. Obviously, we did a welcome. We'll talk a little bit about what we expect in terms of the lay of the land of Capitol Hill. We'll talk about this 117th Congress, and we'll overview what our priorities are for this session of Congress, which will encompass 2 years as the President-elect and Congress race towards the midterms in 2022. Okay. This is where we are. I'm sure many of you have been watching C-SPAN or CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, or where else you are, PBS, to get some news. A lot of things have been happening since the turn to the new year. As of right now, the House of Representatives only has 433 members of the House. There are a couple elections still need to be resolved. The current House leadership right now is Speaker Nancy Pelosi was reelected to be Speaker for the 117th Congress, and Minority Leader will be Kevin McCarthy, also from California. The chair of the Education and Labor Committee will be the same as it was in the 116th Congress. We have Chairman Bobby Scott from Virginia, and ranking member is Virginia Fox from North Carolina. Interestingly, Virginia Fox is also one of our former community college presidents in North Carolina. On the House Appropriations Committee, which is one of the most important committees because it doles out funds for a myriad of purposes, including funds for the Pell Grant program and student financial aid. We did have a changeover. Nita Lowy, who was the former chair of the committee, retired, and so we have a new chair, and that is Rosa DeLauro, who is from Connecticut. The ranking member is the same with Kate Granger from Texas, and Rosa DeLauro will remain the subcommittee chair for the Labor, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Subcommittee. And Tom Cole will also stay as ranking. So we won't see much turnover except for the fact that Representative DeLauro is now the chair of the whole committee on appropriations. Next slide. In terms of the Senate, obviously, for those of you who've been watching the news, we also had some change. This presentation, if we had given it to you all on January 4th, would have been a little bit different, pending the Georgia Senate elections. Based upon the results of the Georgia elections right now, we are expecting a 50-50 split between Democrats and Republicans. with Vice President-elect Harris, who is a senator, obviously, who will become vice president. The vice president breaks all ties in the Senate, so therefore the majority will go to the Democrats. This new makeup will mean that the new majority leader will be Chuck Schumer, who's from New York, and the current majority leader right now, Mitch McConnell, will become minority leader of the Senate. So that also means we'll have some significant changes in terms of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which deals with a number of issues. The ranking member at that time, earlier this month, Patty Murray, will now become chair of that committee. In the end of the 116th Congress, Lamar Alexander, who was chair of the Health Committee, retired also, and so therefore we don't tentatively know right now who will be the ranking member for the Health Committee. And then for the Senate Appropriations Committee, we'll have Chair Leahy from Vermont, and the ranking member will be Richard Shelby, who was previously the chair. And in terms of the subcommittee chair, Senator Patty Murray will be chair, and the ranking member will be Ward Blunt. All of these individuals, in terms of appropriation committees, have been strong supporters of community colleges. With that lay of the land, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, right? Okay.
Yes, thanks so much, Jihang. Hi, everyone. Now that we've heard how both the House and Senate will be structured during the 117th Congress, I'll walk through some possible agenda items for Congress and the administration over the next 2 years. Hopefully, this will help contextualize and put into perspective some of the legislative asks that we included in our joint legislative agenda, which my colleagues will dive into shortly. First, I'll talk through some funding bills that we might see Congress consider. First, there's a process called budget reconciliation, and this process is usually used when one party has control of the White House and both chambers of Congress, which we know will be the case in the 117th Congress. And basically what it does is it allows committees within Congress that have jurisdiction over mandatory spending programs to sort of restructure spending. So that could be, increasing or decreasing funding for different programs or shuffling some things around in a fairly condensed timeline. And so it's important to note that for our purposes, the House Education and Labor Committee, as well as the Senate Help Committee, would be able to participate in the budget reconciliation process if it were to happen, since they have jurisdiction over some mandatory programs, including the Pell Grant program and other higher education programs. In the past, we've seen the budget reconciliation process be used for things like deficit reduction and tax cuts. In the case of the 117th, President-elect Biden and the incoming Congress have mentioned possibly using it as a way to address budgetary needs related to the pandemic and sort of like the economic fallout of the pandemic and maybe future recovery. So that's definitely something that we are keeping an eye on. In addition to that, we will also see Congress revisit appropriations again for FY 2022. As you all might have seen, Congress passed a fairly large omnibus bill towards the end of December that included both pandemic relief funding and fiscal year 2021 funding. So we are funded through 2021. Congress will need to take a look now at fiscal year 2022. And that includes all federal programs, including those associated with education and labor. And in the FY 2021 funding bill, the Department of Education received a small boost of about, they received a total of $73.5 billion in discretionary funding, which is a small boost from FY 2020. And we might see a larger boost this year in funding overall because the budget caps that were in place won't be in play this year. And so that's definitely an opportunity for us to advocate for stronger funding for the programs that are so important for community colleges and their students. We might also see Congress take up the debt ceiling. The current debt ceiling expires in July 2021. And basically what the debt ceiling is the limit for how much debt the federal government can have. And so we might see that raised in light of the extra spending that has been happening per the pandemic. And then lastly, in terms of funding, we could see additional pandemic relief and recovery legislation be considered this Congress, most likely the first half of this year. As I mentioned before, at the end of December, Congress passed and the White House signed into law about $900 billion in pandemic-related aid, including $22.7 billion in much-needed aid for institutions of higher education. But we know that just given the impacts of the pandemic, there's always room for more aid and help, and a need for more aid and help. So that's definitely something we see Congress looking at. Also notably, the bill that was passed in December didn't include funding for states and cities, which was a huge priority for a lot of stakeholders because of the state cuts that states have had to face, which also ripple down to our institutions and others. And so we might see that included in a future pandemic relief package. And I will note that we don't have pandemic related aid specifically listed in our joint agenda, but we will be providing backgrounders and other kind of tools and information prior to the National Legislative Summit for folks so that they can, talk to their legislators about pandemic related aid and the importance of it. Beyond funding, we might also see Congress take up some large legislative priorities and reauthorizations, including the Higher Education Act reauthorization. The Higher Education Act is the main federal policy governing higher education institutions and programs. And as many of you know, it hasn't been updated in a very long time, over 10 years. And it has been a shared priority for both of our associations to see it reauthorized and modernized. So that students and institutions can make better use of the funding that's available to them at the federal level, and just make sure that access is prioritized. And so we did see an appetite over the last couple of years in Congress for reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. A lot of that momentum kind of stalled out when the pandemic set in and a lot of the attention was turned to pandemic related aid, but we might see both the House and Senate kind of revisit Higher Education Act reauthorization and hopefully take it up. So that's also something that we're going to talk more about during this presentation. Additionally, we might see an infrastructure package come out of Congress. We've heard the past couple of years that that's been a priority, but I feel like now it's even larger of a priority given that job creation in light of everything that's happening is super important. Also, broadband is included in infrastructure, and that's definitely a priority for a lot of folks. So we might see Congress take that up. We might also see DACA-related legislation, and DACA is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which was created in 2012 by the Obama administration. So we might see, because there's been a lot of kind of uncertainty and changes around the DACA program, we might see Congress try to come up with a more permanent solution for individuals who are DACA recipients currently. And then lastly, we might see Congress look at the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was passed not that long ago. But it's the federal policy that governs training programs and how they're structured across the US. And obviously this is becoming more important, and we want to make sure it's as accessible as possible for people to access, valuable training dollars and education and training programs. So that's also something we might be seeing. And then from the administration perspective, we know that President-elect Biden ran on a fairly robust higher education platform that definitely emphasized the role of community colleges in both higher education and the workforce. We also know that the future First Lady, Jill Biden, is a community college professor, which makes her familiar with a lot of the issues that community colleges have faced and are facing. So we anticipate that we could see a lot of movement in the higher education space from the Biden administration. Some of the things he might do or focus on is reversing some current regulations that the Trump administration had put in place, including those related to Title IX, which, as you all know, the Trump administration went through a formal rulemaking process to change how institutions address sexual misconduct on campus. The Biden administration could unwind that rule and revert back to Obama era guidance. We could also see the Biden administration lift restrictions on international students. We've seen a lot of movement around international students kind of related to the pandemic. The administration saying maybe they can't, stay if they can't go to in-person classes, or just putting other restrictions on the time they're allowed to stay here. We might see the Biden administration address some of that. Additionally, we might see some policies like reinstated that the Trump administration tried to either roll back or remove, including those related to the Daca program, which I talked about. So we might see President-elect Biden, work with Congress to try to come up with a more permanent solution for Dreamers. We might also see the reinstatement of the borrower defense to repayment, which cancels debt of borrowers whose colleges made misrepresentations concerning student loans and their education programs. And we also might see the revival of the gainful employment rule, which is aimed at ensuring that certain, post-secondary programs do in fact prepare students for gainful employment. Some new initiatives we might see come out of the Biden administration include widespread student loan forgiveness. We have heard that President-elect Biden said that he'll call on Congress immediately to cancel up to $10,000 in federal student loan debt per borrower upon taking office. Obviously, that'll require some help from Congress, but that's definitely going to be at the top of his list. And then I mentioned that President-elect Biden had a fairly robust community college platform and higher education platform, and that included tuition-free community college. So we might see America's College Promise programs and others be at the top of President-elect Biden's list as well, and working with Congress on that too. And with that, I will turn it over to Jose.
Thank you, Katie. Welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just a quick reminder, we want to make sure we get to all your questions, but we don't want them to get lost in the chat. So if you can also use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, that can help us keep track of how many questions are being asked, and we can get to them at the end of the presentation. So before we get into the actual topics and the different issues that we are going to be working with Congress and the administration to advance for community colleges, I just want to give you a little bit of context of what the legislative agenda is. So legislative agenda is a document. It's a very comprehensive document that AACC and ACCT staff compile every 2 years in collaboration and based on feedback from our members. And this document is released at the start of every new Congress. So with the start of the 117th Congress, we're releasing our new legislative agenda. Katie mentioned earlier that this document will not include stimulus funding or pandemic-related funding or pandemic-related asks. And that's because this document is meant to live for the next 2 years. It's the issues that we want Congress to address for our institutions, for our students. We will have what you all commonly know as the green sheet, which is our legislative priorities. Those are more timely issues that we expect Congress to address in the next 6 months, 6 to 9 months. And that will include our stimulus asks, which you all will be looking forward to. And we'll be sharing that with you as we get closer to NLS. So the document covers a huge range of issues from higher education to workforce to international education. And these are all the various issues that impact our institutions, that impact you as trustees, that impact different stakeholders, and especially our students. The agenda you'll see from Congress to Congress, it doesn't change a lot because a lot of our asks don't necessarily change. A lot of our priorities don't change. We care about providing high quality education, making sure that our education is affordable and that it's accessible to everyone. And those are along the lines of the tasks that we ask from Congress every 2 years. However, there's always some changes, things come up, there's new issues that arise for our institutions, there are issues that Congress actually resolves, it may take some time, Congress is very slow, but we have, even now, there's a couple of issues in the document that we'll talk about that were luckily addressed at the very tail end of the 116th Congress. So we'll be going a little bit over that, and we'll start with what I consider to be the cornerstone of our priorities and the cornerstone of making higher education and post-secondary education accessible to everyone, which is federal Pell grants. Within our legislative agenda, there are several key issues that we care about within Pell grants. First and foremost, extending Pell Grant eligibility to short-term education programs. A lot of our institutions offer programs that currently are not eligible for Pell Grants because they don't have the requirement. So right now, we want to make sure that programs that are at least 150 clock hours or 8 weeks of instruction are able to be Pell Grant eligible. The cap right now, if I'm not mistaken, is 16 weeks of instruction. So we want to make sure that these programs are also eligible. We know that a lot of these programs can lead to high-paying jobs and also avoid really high debt for our students. It can be an amplifying into the middle class. So we want to make sure that Congress takes a look at this. There's several proposals that have been introduced over the past years, and I'm sure a lot of those proposals will be reintroduced to Congress, and we're happy to continue advocating for this. Along those lines, we also want to make sure that the maximum award of Pell Grant is increased to maintain its purchasing power. As you may be aware, when the Pell Grant was established in the 1970s, it covered 70% of a student's tuition and cost of attending college. Nowadays, it's around 30%, if not slightly lower than 30%. So while the cost of tuition and the cost of obtaining a post-secondary education has gone up, the Pell Grants have lagged. We've been very successful over the past several years, both in a bipartisan manner with a Republican majority in Congress, as well as the Democratic majority in the House, to get small increases of at least $150 to at least keep up with inflation. But we do know that there is a need for the maximum Pell Grant to be increased so that it covers more for our students. We also want to make sure that the lifetime eligibility for Pell is increased to 12 semesters. It used to be 15 semesters. It was shortened down to 12 semesters. It's currently 12 semesters. But we want to make sure that goes up because, as you know, many of our students tend to take breaks between their education. They may be part-time. It may take them longer to complete their education. We don't want them to run out of their Pell eligibility before they get the opportunity to complete their education and obtain their degrees. One note, and this is what I was referring to earlier, is one of our priorities listed in our document is also second chance Pell, or what is known as second chance Pell, which is restoring eligibility for incarcerated students to obtain Pell Grants. There have been, through the Department of Education, this was started during the Obama administration and continued at increase during the Trump administration, a lot of pilot programs allowing institutions to cover Pell for incarcerated students, but it was still a ban under the law based on the 1996 crime bill. This has been taken care of in the pandemic relief bill that passed in December. They reinstated second chance Pell. So we have that. That's a victory that we can already take. And again, we want to thank you all for your advocacy on this, as well as all the different stakeholders that made sure that Congress was aware that this was a high priority for everyone. In addition to federal Pell Grants, there's other programs that make post-secondary education accessible for students, and that also allow our institutions to better serve a wide variety of students. And those are also included in our document, in our legislative agenda. For example, we advocate for strengthening and increasing of the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant, as well as the Federal Work-Study Program, which many of our institutions take advantage of in order to ensure that our students have the capital and the resources to afford their education. In addition to that, there's a lot of programs, support programs that our institutions take part of, such as TRIO, Gear Up, C-Campus, and C-Campus particularly, this is childcare support. As you know, we have many students who are student parents, and as this pandemic has shown, you can't really have a functioning workforce without childcare, and you can't really have a workforce that can be retrained and reskilled through our institutions if they also don't have childcare. So C-Campus, TRIO, Gear Up particularly help needy low-income students who want to get a higher education, a post-secondary education, but need an additional support. And our institutions want to provide that support, and we can do it through these programs. So we want to make sure that Congress continues supporting and strengthening these programs. In addition to that, we have the Strengthening Institutions Program, which is Title 3A of the Higher Education Act. This program, within the Title III of the Higher Education Act, many of those programs are aimed at different minority serving institutions, HBCUs. The Strengthening Institutions program is one that is geared mostly towards community colleges. This is a program that provides additional resources to underserved institutions so that they can have the capacity to provide high quality education to many students. And going off of that same vein, the rest of the Title III and Title V programs are also those that we advocate and ask for additional support, additional strengthening. These are programs that support the historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges and universities, and other minority serving institutions. I'm gonna take a break now and pass it over to my colleague David to continue speaking on, no, I have one more. Actually, no, this is David. I'm gonna let David take this one.
Thanks, Jose. Jose is going to get a break, but the audience is not going to get a break. We'll keep going through these items in our legislative agenda, and just want to thank you all this afternoon for being with us and being interested in the work that we're doing here. We couldn't do it without your engagement. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about our top priorities in the Higher Education Act reauthorization. Katie mentioned a few moments ago about the fact that with the change in the composition and majority control in the Senate, there's perhaps a little bit greater likelihood that there may be a reauthorization bill enacted in this Congress. Of course, as you heard earlier, there's quite a few items that will probably draw floor time and attention in addition to or in greater priority than the reauthorization, but we are hopeful that we might see legislation in this Congress. It's too early to tell. We do know that the House Democrats on the Education and Labor Committee, who moved the bill through in Congress in 2019, are interested in reintroducing a version of their bill in the first part of the current Congress. And Patty Murray didn't know that she was going to be chairman of the Health Committee until a week ago, Tuesday. So I mean, she's and her staff are still, and leadership are still developing their plans about how they're going to sequence legislation. One of the things, though, that relates to what Jose was just talking about in terms of the really remarkable achievements we had in the Consolidated Appropriations Bill and the FAFSA Simplification Act, which included the Second Chance Pell, that reflected the fact that there was a lot of work that had already been done on the Higher Education Act reauthorization, bipartisan work in the Senate in the last Congress. And so some of that work may be reflected in whatever comes out of the Senate in this Congress in terms of Higher Education Act reauthorization, even though, as I think most of you know, the former chairman of that committee, Lamar Alexander, has retired, and we're not sure at this point who's going to be the ranking member on the committee, as we mentioned earlier. So the bottom line there is that we're not exactly sure whether and how and when the higher ed reauthorization might be moved forward in this Congress, but we do know, and Jose mentioned this in terms of the Pell Grant program, we do know that it's extraordinarily important to our students and our institutions. And in fact, the programs do need to be updated in many ways. As Katie stated, Congress is now 12 years into having completed their last reauthorization. And so we're eager to see this legislation move. So with that by way of backdrop, let me just talk about a few of the items on the agenda and that are priorities in this area. First of all, the federal-state partnership to support tuition-free community college. That is essentially another term or label for the America's College Promise proposal that the Obama administration advanced and was contained in the House legislation I mentioned a moment ago, supported by the House Committee Democrats. The reason why we call it federal-state partnership in part is because the program does require states to contribute a substantial amount of money in addition to federal dollars in order to support and promote and provide the free community college or tuition-free community college in various terms and conditions. So there are a lot of complicated details, important provisions that are part of this proposal. We strongly support, of course, a federal program that would provide first dollar free community college tuition. But we want to make sure that that program works in all of our states with all the different funding structures, governance structures, and other policies that come along with that as we advocate for this program. We are hopeful that the Biden administration will advance this proposal in a very forceful way and a high profile way, which will make it easier for us to advance that program in Congress. The next item relates to how the monies that are allocated to campuses who then award a federal work study and supplemental educational opportunity grants to their students. Some of you will remember that the way these formulas work is that the colleges that have been in the program for a long time get a disproportionate amount of money. Basically, they're allocated the funds that they were previously, even though higher education enrollments have changed, institutions have been added, and the money does not go to institutions on the basis of the need. And we believe, because it's the right thing to do and because it serves our institutions better, that needs to be changed. So that's something that we are promoting and something that we've made some progress on in previous versions of the Higher Education Act on the people who are benefiting through the current formulas, which tend to be four-year colleges, particularly private institutions, are on the other side of this issue from us. The next item relates to student borrowing, and what do we mean by responsible student borrowing? And my dear colleague Ji-Hang Lee has worked on this quite a bit over time, but there are many aspects to it. But one of the things that we want to make sure is that students aren't borrowing more money than they absolutely need to complete their studies, recognizing that grant funds in many cases aren't adequate for students to alone for their students to complete their education and be successful. There are a couple of things though that we do support. One of them is that we think that students who are only enrolled half-time or less than full-time should have their loan amounts maximums reduced proportionally to that. So if you're a half-time student, you should only qualify for half of what the maximum loan would otherwise be at whatever level of education you are within post-secondary, because they ratchet up as you move through college. We think that that's just a common sense safeguard against over borrowing. We also believe that colleges should have greater discretion in limiting the borrowing by category of student. The just enacted Simplification Act that we've talked about a couple times reaffirmed the existing statutory language, which circumscribes pretty narrowly what colleges can do in this area. So I have to say, this is an agenda item where we need some more work to be done in order to persuade members of Congress to give our colleges this administrative discretion. It is a touchy issue. It's a touchy issue because members of Congress are understandably somewhat reluctant to allow institutions to be setting policy and limiting what is essentially federal entitlement to students. Otherwise, unless institutions set different policies. And we've made progress with Congress on this, but we have a ways to go, and the devil is going to be in the details on that. Finally, on this slide, in terms of our higher education agenda, there still is a significant number of community college students. It's a number that is decreased in percentage terms over time, but there still is a substantial number of our students who do not have a high school diploma, but who were admitted to community college credit-bearing degree programs and who are not currently qualifying for student financial assistance because of that. And it's our position that if the colleges are enrolling these students, if the states and local governments and the trustees are supporting these students in their programs, putting their money where their mouth is by helping pay the cost of, or subsidizing, if you will, their education, the federal government should engage in a partnership with our institutions and allow those students. It's a small number, probably less than 1% of our students at this point. California is one state where we have quite a lot of these students. We think that the government ought to recognize the importance of those students getting funding. And just by way of historical context, the government did in fact, under some particular conditions, did allow students who didn't have a high school diploma to qualify for federal student aid until fiscal year 2012. And at that point, in significant part because Congress was interested in limiting expenditures in the Pell Grant program, they took away ability to benefit eligibility. We've gotten it back for career pathways programs, but we again want to make it available to all students. And I'll try to move along, colleagues, so that we get through all these slides. I'm sorry to maybe talk a little bit more than I should have. We are supporting a federal unit record data system, which would be a national data system that would track students throughout their post-secondary education courses, which we think will yield the data that will help students, institutions, and policymakers all understand better the performance of our colleges, which we think will benefit our colleges. Somewhat related to that, we believe that another aspect of federal information and evaluation that's not what it ought to be relates to default rates. We think that the percentage of students that borrow ought to be factored directly into an institution's cohort default rate. The default rate, loss of eligibility for high default rates was reaffirmed in the Simplification Act, so it's an important issue for us. Some of you will remember risk sharing, which was the the kind of the Friday the 13th for us in our lobbying, and was something that was included in a variety of proposals in the last two Congresses, and we will oppose any efforts that would require community colleges to pay back money to the federal government, whether it's because of student defaults or students who don't complete their programs or what have you. Finally, accreditation is an area where we simply feel that the current accreditation process is working well for the by and large, and that we don't want to have undue government structuring or conditioning or intervention in the accreditation process. That one of its strengths is the fact that it is fundamentally a voluntary process that's engaged in institutions for quality assessment and quality improvement, and signaling to other institutions that they meet certain standards. And we think that the government should, when in doubt, perhaps not be overly involved in accreditation. Reporting and record keeping and disclosure remains a big issue for us. I won't go into detail on that, but something that we're very sensitive to. We also, at the same time, are pushing for innovation in higher education and facilitating that. Particularly dual enrollment is an area, and guided pathways, but dual enrollment, there have been a number of proposals on the table that would provide support for that, and we strongly endorse those proposals. We do believe the best way to go about doing that is through providing money to institutions through states. And then finally, on the Higher Education Act reauthorization, we do want to keep the 90-10 rule and strengthen that, actually, which will require for-profit colleges to have at least 10% of their revenues come from non-federal sources. And I have one more slide, I'll go through it quickly. We, as you all know, ACCT has done a lot of good work in this area. We're very keen about the hunger and the insecurity, food insecurity and housing insecurity of our students. We are hopeful that we can get some direct support for that from the government in the context of the HEA. With the SNAP program, it's a program where many of our students who might qualify for that are not aware of their eligibility. There were some good provisions on that in the House Committee Reported Affordability Act that we support, and that we'd like to see that strengthened. And also, just the latest COVID bill relaxed some of the SNAP eligibility requirements for college students and part-time students, and that's something that we endorse, would like to see made permanent. We support veterans and active duty personnel in a variety of ways. We want to make sure that they can get in-state tuition where appropriate. There's the Centers for Excellence for Veterans. It's a small program, but it's very useful where those funds are delivered on our campuses. And then finally, getting back to the point on the last slide about the for-profit colleges, I'm sure many of you are aware of the abuses, the recruiting, and the low quality that is of education that has been offered, as it were, to veterans and active duty service members alike. And we believe that some of the provisions that were put in the bill that was passed at the end of last Congress will be helpful, and we're looking to do more of those things. We think, in truth, that community colleges should be enrolling those students, not for-profit institutions. So with that, thanks again, everybody, for being with us, and I will turn things over to Jim.
Thanks very much, David. And I'm going to turn now to another major aspect of the community college mission, and that, of course, is workforce development, and also say a couple of things about our infrastructure positions. What you see here on this slide are largely funding positions in terms of our priority programs in this area in general, and starting off with a new kid on the block, really, the Strengthening Community College Training Grants Program. That is just got its second year of funding in the FY21 bill at $45 million. And the way we're thinking about this program, which is a successor of sorts to the TACT program and before that, the Community-Based Job Training Grants Program, is an ongoing program to address, to help your institutions develop more capacity to do workforce training programs. And we view this as side by side, or even maybe a vehicle itself for even a larger scale investment in our workforce training capacity as it relates to helping the country recover from the pandemic. So kind of a dual track, if you will, position there in terms of workforce training. CTE programs, the Perkins program it continues to be one of the, if not the largest source of federal support ongoing for our colleges outside of the student aid programs. So obviously it remains very important. We've seen some increases in that program in the last few years, but really would like to see a much more substantial investment. And the WIOA programs, the workforce innovation programs that Katie was talking about earlier, we continue to advocate for more funding for those programs. We know that colleges have variable experience in terms of their relationship with that system, but many do work very productively with the workforce development system, are very much partners in that system in your local areas, and for that reason, we continue to advocate for more funding for those programs as well. The common complaint there is, not much training gets done through the workforce development system. And, obviously we need more funding to alleviate that situation. And as Katie mentioned at the outset, we are expecting to see at least some activity this year towards reauthorizing that program. So the opportunity not only to potentially increase the funding for it, but also make it work better for our institutions. There are a variety of programs across a lot of different agencies that address the needs of rural institutions, either directly or indirectly. Won't get run down that list now, but departments like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Commerce, in addition to the ones that we normally deal with the most, education and labor, all address the issues of rural colleges, and we're supportive of efforts to do so. Broadband is something that we've had a long history of being in support of. You would have seen this item on our agenda for a while now, but really the experience that we've all had with your institutions going virtual in the spring, and really laid bare the tremendous amount of work we still have to do in order to ensure that broadband access, A, is available in more places than it is right now, and B, is also affordable. In particular for our needy students. We will be continuing to support efforts to do that. There were, just by parenthetically, there were funds included in the end of the year bill for broadband in particular, and amongst several billion dollars worth, yes. And amongst those funding was funding of about $300 million that will in particular go to minority serving institutions. So look for more information about that, as well as some money to just help needy people in general afford broadband access. So some good things were done, but a lot of work needs still to be done in that area of broadband. And then going then to infrastructure, which, as Katie mentioned earlier, these two things are very related, because when we talk about infrastructure, we're not just talking about buildings and roads and so forth, but really people are taking a broader view of the meaning of infrastructure to include broadband and other things like that. So we have, again, a sort of a dual track advocacy position in terms of infrastructure, which we know we've been hearing for, the joke during the last couple of years has been every week is infrastructure week, but we do have some renewed optimism with how high a priority it is for the incoming administration that we'll see some action in this area very soon. And we want to see support both for our own infrastructure needs, our facilities, and of course also for the role that we're going to play in terms of training the workers needed to to complete all these infrastructure projects that may very well be funded. So an important aspect of our workforce development mission overall. Turning to the next slide, we're going a little bit about the DREAM Act and immigration policy and international education, as you can see here. And Katie talked a little bit earlier about the Daca program and our expectation that we'll see that continue under the Biden administration as a priority for them. The one note I'll just put there is that we do have ongoing litigation challenging the legality of that program. So that that is something that we'll need to keep an eye on, and maybe make that a little bit harder for the Biden administration in terms of DACA. But really, DACA aside, our main goal in this area is to enact legislation that provides a pathway to citizenship for these Dreamer students and other Dreamer individuals. And legislation is the only way you can do that. DACA cannot provide that pathway to citizenship. So that is something that remains very high on our agenda. Many states have gotten around the federal ban on in-state tuition for undocumented students, but nonetheless, we still want to, as part of enacting a DREAM Act legislation, we still want to get rid of the ban that is on the books to hopefully encourage more states to do that and to make it a little bit easier for other states to do it in a more direct way than they've been able to do that. One other initiative that we saw, and is, if I remember correctly, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, is currently in abeyance because of court orders, is something called the public charge rule. What the outgoing administration did in that area was essentially change an existing rule that said that if a person is already received or is likely to receive certain cash benefit programs, that would make their pathway to getting a green card and proceeding on to citizenship that much harder. And what the administration did was essentially expand that public charge test to include a lot of other programs. Fortunately, not on that list were the Title IV student aid programs, and we want to make sure that that remains the case. However, just going even beyond that, it is the case, and we know it's the case, that a lot of students and a lot of other people that are shying away from a lot of programs that they are eligible for because they're afraid of the impact of this public charge rule, even though the programs in question are not actually either not on the list or they're just eligible for the program. So there is negative effect being felt there, even without the rule actually in effect. On the international student front and international education, one thing that we're aware of is that particularly this year, later this year, we're going to have a large backlog of just overall of visa applications that the Department of State and Department of Homeland Security are going to have to deal with. And we want to make sure that student visas are handled expeditiously in that process, both in that kind of immediate term and in an ongoing way. So that continues to remain part of our agenda, as well as funding for the Department of Education Higher Education Act Title VI, which is a panoply of various international education programs, and the Fulbright-Hays program, which is a so we think of Title VI as the domestic programs, things that happen here, and Fulbright-Hays supports people going abroad. Both those programs are generally funded together. We support increased funding for both of them. Community colleges, frankly, are not large players in either of these programs, at least in terms of being direct grantees, although we do get some important grants and support for our institutions, particularly through the undergraduate education program that is part of Title VI. But the other thing to remember about Title VI is that the larger programs, in particular the centers in various areas that are typically housed at four-year universities, a lot of those centers do a lot of work with community colleges, either as partners or beneficiaries of the things that they are doing. So there's a good indirect effect in addition to the smaller direct effect on our institutions through Title VI. And then lastly, on the next slide, the higher education tax benefits for students remain a large part of our agenda as well. The bottom line here, in terms of both of these things that are on here, both the lifetime learning credit and the American Opportunity Tax Credit, is what we are trying to do is make both of those credits work better for community college students, particularly financially needy community college students. With the lifeline learning credit, the fact is that right now you have to have tuition of $10,000 or more to get the full benefit of that credit, which obviously does not apply to the vast majority of our programs. So we want to get changes in the formula for that program that allow students in lower cost programs to more fully benefit from that credit. Because right now it's really primarily graduate students in higher cost institutions that are getting the benefit of that credit. And then turning to the American Opportunity Tax Credit, again, making it work better for our students. And the biggest problem there is interplay with the Pell Grant program. So that those two bullets should really be read together. We want to make the Pell Grant program completely non-taxable. The way that it works now is that the portion of the Pell Grant that is attributable to students' tuition and fees and some certain other limited expenses, books, that part of the Pell Grant is currently non-taxable. Any other amount of a Pell Grant that a student uses for other things that the Pell Grant covers, like living expenses and so forth, that is actually taxable income to the student. And of course, as you might imagine, as you can surmise, that really only affects community college students for the most part because of our lower tuition levels. The other problem there is that you can only apply those what we call those qualified educational expenses to one thing. You can't use them for both the purposes of the Pell Grant and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. So when a student goes and does the AOTC and benefits from that program, the qualified expenses that they use for that are then reduced on the Pell Grant side, which the net effect of that being that if they get the AOTC, they're all of a sudden making more of their Pell Grant taxable than was the case before. So we want to pass legislation that fixes those problems, as well as some other aspects of the AOTC, making more of it refundable to have it help even needier students more. Is another part of that, important part of that platform as well. But I'm going to turn it back to Katie and Jose now, and we'll be able to get to your questions and hopefully answer them.
Okay. All right, we have a couple questions. I think in terms of timestamp, there's a question from Terry. I'm hearing some about earmarks that may be revamped and may come back. I'll be quick about this. We have heard some rumblings of the support for earmarks, especially from House appropriators and Senate appropriators. But as of right now, we don't see a mechanism or pathway right now for earmarks to come back quickly. And I would just note it also is dependent upon whether or not the administrations are supportive of this idea. The Senator, President Obama did oppose earmarks. We don't necessarily know where President Biden is on earmarks. There's a question about Pell Grant changes in the omnibus, expanded eligibility, permanent, for example, permanent, or must be reauthorized. David, do you want to handle that one real quick?
Sure, they're permanent. The Higher Education Act was changed by those provisions. So even though the vehicle was an appropriations bill, which is time limited, as you know, those are permanent changes of statute. We are happy to report.
Okay. There is a question about, is there any existing policy language that would outline the federal state funding arrangement for tuition-free community college? What we could do, Jose, can we drop a line for the CAA program? I mean, CAA bill that was passed by the House committee?
I'm currently sharing screen, so I'm not able to pull the link.
Okay.
Anybody else want to do that?
Yeah, we can provide you the information that was passed by the House Education and Labor Committee that included some of the language that outlined the relationship for the free community college program. Okay. Dr. Warren, David, do you want to handle this one? This one was, as you talk about funding for students without a diploma, what would
Yeah,
that include? Enrollment?
we, no, the ATV is only for students who are beyond the age of compulsory attendance for high school in their state and are not enrolled in high school. The ATV would not allow those students to access the Pell Grant for dual enrollment. And I know some of our members do support that, and it may not be popular, but given the cost of it and given a lot of other issues, Dr. Warren, that we could maybe talk about, we thought on balance that it's not the right item for our agenda. What we do support though strongly is money being delivered, again, through the states to local school districts and college partnerships to develop programs that are focused on and benefit lower income students.
David, there was in the CAA, there was a dual enrollment program, correct?
Yes, there was.
Yeah, so there was some a program that would be authorized that appropriators would need a fund that was included in the CAA. Does someone want to handle Riza's question about financial assistance for distance learning, facilities, faculty development?
Well, I can just jump in and say that I mean, that's not explicitly part of our legislative agenda, but the funds that were provided through the CARES Act 2 legislation that's just being implemented or announced the awards today did allow colleges to use those funds for upgrading their online education programs. That would in fact include facilities. There are some limitations in the law, but you could use that money for that particular purpose, and absolutely you could use it for faculty development. So that would, you know, all those activities would be covered under the CARES 2. And as Jihang mentioned, you know, we are going to be advocating for more money for under the stimulus rubric early in this Congress for our institutions, and we're going to be doing a careful needs assessment about, you know, where the help is most needed.
Yeah, and I would just add also the funding that I mentioned that's in the omnibus bill for broadband, and in particular the funding that is dedicated to minority serving institutions. That's basically what that's for as well. So necessity has really been the mother of invention here in terms of putting resources into and improving our infrastructure for distance learning, and that will continue to be the case.
The last question is from Larry Nespoli. Larry, if we all knew this answer, we would have won the Powerball by now. But I'll let my colleagues kind of weigh in a little bit. I think the story of that quote unquote expectation in this environment has many factors were in play to prevent this expectation from taking hold. So
well, I'll go
to answer.
Is the guy who's the most formally dressed. I'll go first. You know, a lot of factors here, as Jihang just said. First of all, we don't know that later on in the economic recession that has been created through the pandemic, that there won't be people returning to our colleges to receive job training. But your point, Larry, is certainly well taken about what our expectations were. I think what we found is that students attending four-year institutions who we thought we might be enrolling instead have in fact gone and re-enrolled at those colleges. They have seen a 4% enrollment drop in the final numbers for the fall term of 2020 compared to the 10.1% of the community colleges. But it turns out that our students are, we assume, we infer, are the most vulnerable to the economic impact of the pandemic. We've seen the biggest drop, as you probably know, in first-year students, particularly male students and underrepresented minority students, Black students, Latino students. Again, concentrating on male students, which is a little bit surprising too, given the the childcare issue that was mentioned earlier. But I think the bottom line is that our population is a more fragile population, and a lot of would-be first-time students just decided to stay away in the pandemic, and we're hoping though that they will subsequently enroll in again. Whether or not we witness an enrollment spike is hopefully it's not the case, but if the recession continues, we may well see increased enrollments in our particular job training programs.
And if I can add real quick, just to echo some of what David said, we would have to have a crystal ball to know the actual answer to this. But if we look at the data of who were those students who dropped in enrollment, like David said, it was a lot of first-time students who decided to stay home. It was also a lot of non-traditional students, a lot of students who are 30 years or older, who may be working students, who may be student parents, who have been incredibly impacted by the pandemic. So as much as our calculations were based on what we've seen in previous economic downturns, the impact of the pandemic has been incredibly greater than any of us could have foretold on these specific student populations.
Relative to that question, we just hope that our enrollment rebounds and that many of our students do come back to the fold, and it is important. I don't think we have any more questions, and we are at time. I do just want to make a formal announcement. As you know, we are all working towards the 2021 Virtual Community College National Legislative Summit, which will be February 8th through the 10th. We encourage you to sign up. You can go visit you can register at nls.acct.org. We are also providing all of our member institutions an opportunity to do a group registration rate. It's something similar to what we've done for our annual Leadership Congress. We hope you are able to attend. In order for us to support all of you as we work in this new medium of virtual everything, we will be conducting a webinar next Friday and talking a little bit about some of the best practices and some of the things that we've been working on. And we'll also have a member institution talk to us a little bit about some of the things that they're conducting. So please join us. And then following, we will then have another presentation on February the 4th, which we'll be announcing the release of our green sheet. I'm sure all of you are very excited to see our green sheet. We have not decided to change the color. So that's news in and of itself. So we hope to see you all at that point in time. And in addition, there's some more URLs down here for our advocacy websites. Please thank our participants, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar or at the NLS. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, guys.